Diary. What a day it's been. I realized that, despite the hustle and bustle of daily life, I needed to get the next episode of the Classic English Literature podcast out. But I have no idea what it should be about. Well, I've puzzled and puzzed till my puzzler was sore, and then I thought of something I hadn't before. I could do an episode on you. I could do an episode on diaries. You see, the show has been up to its neck in 17th century literature for a good while now, and it's about this time that keeping a diary becomes a thing. I mean, people had kept diaries before, maybe even going back to ancient Egypt. And I suppose we could consider the meditative notes of medieval mystics diaries of sorts. Diary, by the by, comes from the Latin diarium, meaning daily allowance. Probably first popped up in English around the 1580s, and it seems our old friend Ben Jonson was the first to set it down in writing in 1605's Volpone. Anyway, diary, you became increasingly popular over the 1600s because of a few different factors. One thing I've mentioned in the show before is the increasing emphasis on the sovereignty and agency of the individual in Western culture. How during the Renaissance, Europeans increasingly saw themselves as unique, autonomous consciousnesses. Selves, in short. The deep psychological interiority of Prince Hamlet is the greatest example of this, I guess. The notion had always been latent in Judeo-Christian culture. Free will presupposes an individual conscience that can exercise that will. But it really moved to the fore after Martin Luther started taunting the Pope in the early 16th century. Additionally, because of Protestantism's emphasis on biblical study, compounded by advances in printing technology, literacy flourished. Education became essential, not only to conduct the business of a growing mercantile society, but also for one's spiritual nourishment. For example, it's estimated that at the turn of the 17th century, about 10 or 15% of the English population could read and or write. By the time of the Civil Wars, we guess about 30% of men and 10% of women were literate. But by the century's end, 45% of men and 30% of women knew their letters. So, you take those two things, the birth of a navel-gazing culture and the rise of literacy, and of course the diary will become the hot new trend. One count says that 363 diaries survive from this period, as opposed to some 20 maybe from the previous century. And what are these diaries about? Well, at first they seem to largely concern record keeping. Either news of the day or business accounts, that sort of thing. Still quite useful as historical documents, but not quite what people think you're for nowadays. By mid-century, though, we do have a book of advice by a minister named John Beadle, and among his other pearls of wisdom is the admonishment to keep a diary. Quote, "We have our state diurnals relating to national affairs. Tradesmen keep their shop books, merchants their account books, lawyers have their books of precedents, physicians have their experiments. Some wary husbands have kept a diary of daily disbursements. Travelers a journal of all that they have seen and hath befallen them in their way. A Christian, that would be more exact, hath more need and may reap much more good by such a journal as this. We are all but stewards, factors here, and must give a strict account in that great day to the high Lord of all our ways, and of all his ways towards us." So you see there, diary? You really begin as a means of examining one's soul, preparing for that Great exit interview from this vale of tears. And that makes sense, too, now that I think about it, because despite better education and rising literacy, Protestant England had largely deprived itself of a crucial psychological outlet, the confessor. Under Catholicism, one examined one's conscience before the sacrament of reconciliation, and whatever someone might believe about the spiritual reality of the sacrament, it does at least provide a therapeutic effect. When popery was abolished, that therapy went with it, and so an alternative had to be found. Now, it's not until the mid-1800s, I think, that someone first writes down the now hackneyed salutation, "Dear Diary." But it does seem that well before that, people began constructing their diaries as personas, as like almost sounding boards for their innermost thoughts. Is parasocial too strong a word for the relationship I'm trying to describe? It seems much easier to unburden your soul to a person, in quotes, than to reflect in absolute solitariness. I reckon that's why people often talk to themselves when flustered or upset. Imagining yourself outside yourself as another person to achieve the comfort and clarity of dialogue. Isaac Ambrose, a Presbyterian minister who wrote a widely read devotional book called Looking Unto Jesus, nods to this dialectical nature of the diarist who, quote, observes something of God to his soul and of his soul to God. There's another minister, fella from Essex named Ralph Jocelyn, kept a diary for over 60 years. And while he does concur with Ambrose about the contemplative function of a diary, saying that it is, quote, a thankful observation of divine providence and goodness towards me, he finishes that sentence with, quote, and a summary view of my life. He writes about his deep religious devotion, his weekly preaching, and his pastoral duties, but also his more intimate concerns, his fears about illness, his love for his family, his worries over the well-being of his parishioners, I guess he would say congregation. He does reflect on the seismic events shaking England at the time, from the chaos of the Civil War to the uneasy calm of the Restoration. But what makes his diary especially remarkable is its emotional depth. He even notes his birth status and his relative poverty. Quote, I was the eldest son in our whole family, and yet possessed not a foot of land, in which yet I praise God I have not felt inward discontent and grudging. God has given me himself, and he is all, and will make up all other things to me. He tells of his marriage, one that's generally happy and, remarkable for the time, rather equitable. Quote, you can consider, here I was wont to see my dear wife, here to enjoy her delightsome embraces, her counsel, spiritual discourses, furtherance, encouragement in the ways of God. I was wont to find her and help to ease me of the burthen and trouble of household affairs, whose countenance welcomed me home with joy. Jocelyn writes with great tenderness about his wife and children, and he doesn't flinch from recording the pain of loss when his children die, something rarely seen in the writing of the men from this period. So it seems, diary, that you are quite useful for spiritual edification, for psychological vigor, and for a ground-up view of history.
You know, they say teaching is the mother of all professions, but right now it feels like it's happening inside a pressure cooker. That's why we created Higher Listenings, bringing a dose of joy to the future of learning. We're exploring things like why reading may not be obsolete after all, the remarkable connection between emotion and learning, and the real reason students cheat.
It's not a moral failing. It's the circumstances that they find themselves in.
Join us on Higher Listenings, because those who can make a difference teach.
Well done. Dear Diary, when I ended my last entry, I didn't mean to imply that you are incapable of recording the momentous events of history. Oh, not at all. In fact, truth be told, I probably wouldn't even think to include an episode on 17th century diarists in this podcast were it not for those which do offer us an intimate window into the great upheavals of history. Doesn't hurt either, of course, that some of these diaries came to publication in the early 19th century and thus became widely read as portals to another time. I think that probably when I finally do come to do the episode, I'll start this section by looking at John Evelyn's diary, and that one's a whopper. He kept it from 1640 all the way till his death in 1706. And while he's not exactly an average citizen, he was a landowner, a courtier, and a government official. Oh, and he helped found the Royal Society, so not Joe Sixpack, but still a unique and personal view of not only his family life, but that of his country. Seems he was quite pro-Charles. The entry for January 1649 reads, quote, "The villainy of the rebels proceeding now so far as to try, condemn, and murder our excellent king on the 30th of this month struck me with such horror that I kept the day of his martyrdom a fast, and would not be present at that execrable wickedness, receiving the sad account of it from my brother George and Mr. Owen." You can certainly hear the shock and outrage here, and a deep sense of pseudo-spiritual devotion to the king, right? He fasted. I also like that he includes from where he heard the news of the king's death. Not that it's a grand detail, but just a little hint that obviously these events were much on the minds of the people. Evelyn's not above a little gossip, though, either. He reports in 1653 that on a visit to Lady Gerard, he saw the cursed Lady Nolan, quote, "of whom it was reported that she spit in the king's face as he went to the scaffold. Indeed, her talk and discourse was like an impudent woman." You just know that was written with nose worn quite high. There's a little tossed-off entry for August of 1654 when Evelyn traveled to Leicester, which, though an ugly city, he says, is, quote, "famous for the tomb of the tyrant Richard III, which is now converted to a cistern from which I think cattle drink." I can't really tell if these desert-dry remarks are meant to be so barbed, but I suspect they are. As a sidebar, Diary, do you think I should mention that Richard's body was discovered beneath a Leicester parking lot and then reinterred in Leicester Cathedral back in 2015? No? You're probably right. Quite irrelevant to the episode's main line. Moving on. What other big historical events does Evelyn comment upon? Well, the death of Cromwell gets a terse but pregnant comment. Quote, 3rd September 1658, died that arch-rebel Oliver Cromwell, called Protector. Certainly, Evelyn sees the OC as a destroyer, not a preserver, and almost beneath mentioning, except maybe to gloat a bit. The restoration of Charles II gets a more florid recognition. Quote, 29 May 1660, this came in His Majesty Charles II to London after a sad and long exile and calamitous suffering both of the king and church, being 17 years. This also his birthday, and with a triumph of above 20,000 horse and foot, brandishing their swords and shouting with inexpressible joy. The ways strewn with flowers, the bells ringing, the streets hung with tapestry, fountains running with wine. I stood in the Strand and beheld it and blessed God. And all this without one drop of blood, and by that very army which rebelled against him. Entries for October of that year record the bringing to trial of the regicides, as Evelyn calls them, at the Old Bailey, and the consequent execution of traitors at Charing Cross in the traditional grisly manner. Quote, I saw not their execution, but met their quarters mangled and cut and reeking, as they were brought from the gallows in baskets on the hurdle. Oh, the miraculous providence of God! Not sure how much God is a fan of strangling men, disemboweling them, burning their severed genitals, and then cutting them into 4 pieces, nailing the pieces up as public warnings, but, religion is a very private and personal thing. Actually, that'll make a juicy section for the episode. People always go in for a bit of gore. But to keep the audience engaged, Diary, you have to modulate their emotions. So after a bit of horror, let's move on to something heart-wrenching and sentimental. The end of January 1658 concerns the illness and eventual death of Evelyn's son Dick, whom, quote, it pleased God to visit with fits so extreme. They bundle the child in heavy blankets and place him by a roaring fire, but he, quote, expired to our unexpressible grief and affliction. Yet Evelyn does so with quite great pathos, quote, we lost the prettiest and dearest child that ever parents had, being but 5 years, 5 months, and 3 days old in years. But even at that tender age, a prodigy for wit and understanding, for beauty of body of very angel, and for endowments of mind of incredible and rare hopes. Oh, that's just so heartbreaking. He then goes on to detail a post-mortem examination which discovered a swollen liver, and the recriminations for perhaps having suffocated the boy by making him too warm. Yet, through it all, Evelyn retains his faith in God, his submission to the dictates of providence. Quote, the Lord Jesus sanctify this and all others my afflictions. Amen. Holy cow, Diary. That blows my mind. Evelyn betrays no hint of rage or sense of injustice. If I'm honest, I'm always mystified by people who have undergone great trials in their lives, but keep their faith intact, or indeed amplify it. How do they do that? How did peasants in 1348 not curse God when the plague came? How did those in the Nazi death camps continue to pray? I'm deeply moved by such faith, and I often feel its absence in myself sometimes. And you know what? Evelyn's trials aren't even over yet. On February 15th, mere weeks after burying Dick, the youngest son George dies of dropsy. This entry is more stoic than those for Dick. Evelyn merely writes, quote, God's holy will be done. He was buried in Deptford Church the 17th following. There's a deep sense of exhaustion here, of resignation. Even the prayer feels perfunctory. Such emptiness. Dear Diary, obviously I'll have to include in my episode some discussion of probably the most famous of English diarists, and ironically famous at that, Samuel Pepys. He was a Tory politician, did a lot on the Navy Board and the Admiralty, despite having no maritime experience. Pretty much invented the modern Royal Navy. Apparently quite a gifted bureaucrat. He kept his diary from 1660 to 1669. If anyone can name a famous English diarist, he's the one they name. And I say he's ironically famous for two reasons. One, the style does not in any way feel like what we've come to see as the diary's characteristic, personal, intimate, musing style. Pepys' style is very dry. Not in the humorous way necessarily, just very neutral and declarative, matter of fact. One detects very few instances of emotion. It feels much more journalistic than personal, almost as if Pepys is somehow detached from and observing his own life. Yeah, I guess I talked about that before. But I'll need to be careful not to imply that this style means Pepys is boring. He is certainly not that. The other reason for Pepys's fame being ironic is because he didn't want, by any means, anyone else reading the diary. He composed it in shorthand, and also used a code comprising a mashup of French, Spanish, and Italian. Especially, I guess, when he was writing about all his ladies on the side. But that's actually an interesting point I should stress, I suppose. Pepys doesn't hide anything from himself. He's almost ruthless in his observations and evaluations of his own failings and weaknesses. That's probably why it has become the most famous of diaries. It describes with detached disinterest a very human person. But I shouldn't imply that Pepys was not rather self-impressed. I mean, after all, he devised the diary in its modern form, the private account of one's daily thoughts and activities. He must have thought that these were worth recording at all. When he starts the project, he is, at best, a rather humble factotum, but he will call himself, quote, a very rising man. So, no problem with self-esteem. This journal will track his rise to glory. And despite the great pains he took to keep the diary private, scholars have noted that the text as we now have it has gone through at least 5 revisions. So Pepys was very conscious of how he wanted his life presented, even if just to himself. The first entry is dated 1 January 1659-60, Lord's Day. Now, despite what may seem to us an auspicious day to begin this account of his life, the first day of the first month of a new decade, the events recorded are quite quotidian. Quote, this morning, we living lately in the garret, I rose, put on my suit with great skirts, having not lately worn any other clothes but them. Went to Mr. Gunning's chapel at Exeter House, where he made a very good sermon. Dined at home in the garret, where my wife dressed the remains of a turkey, and in the doing of it she burned her hand. I stayed at home all the afternoon, looking over my accounts. Then went with my wife to my father's, and in going observed the great posts which the city have set up at the conduit in Fleet Street. Supped at my father's, where in came Mrs. Turner and Madam Morris, and supped with us. After that my wife and I went home with them, and so to our own home. Not exciting, I grant that. But the details are rather interesting. He and his wife lived in a garret, or like an attic apartment, and he's been wearing the same suit of clothes repeatedly. I sense the beginnings of a bootstrap story here. He eats. Often, one will find in the diary. Meals are constantly noted. Looks over his accounts, goes to church, visits family. All quite ordinary, but somehow granted significance just by virtue of being recorded. Much of the diary is this kind of window into one man's world. The most famous portions, though, are the ones that offer an eyewitness account of the great turning points in London history. The first, really, is the coronation of Charles II on April 23rd, 1661. Pepys notes that he woke at 4 a.m. and waited about until 11, remarking upon the beauty of Westminster Abbey, the glorious procession of bishops and noblemen, and finally, quote, the king with a sceptre, carried by my Lord Sandwich, and sword and mond before him, and the crown too. The king in his robes, bareheaded, which was very fine. And after all had placed themselves, there was a sermon and the service, and then in the choir at the high altar the king passed through all the ceremonies of the coronation, which to my great grief I and most in the abbey could not see. Well, so much for eyewitnessing, I guess. But there's something so recognizable about that moment to me. You're so close and yet so far away. Great patience and expectation rewarded by missing the event. Alas. Perhaps Pepys drowns his frustration in some celebratory cordial because he writes, quote, we drank the king's health and nothing else till one of the gentlemen fell down stark drunk, and there lay spewing. And I went to my lord's pretty well, but no sooner abed with Mr. Shipley but my head began to hum and I to vomit, and if ever I was foxed it was now, which I cannot say yet because I fell asleep and slept till morning. Only when I waked I found myself wet with my spewing. Thus did the day end with joy everywhere. The second half of 1665 is dominated by the ravages of the plague. The June 7th entry begins in the normal fashion. Woke up, went to the office, the weather very hot, met some colleagues, then to bed. But appended, almost as an afterthought, is as follows, quote, this day, much against my will, I did in Drury Lane see 2 or 3 houses marked with a red cross upon the doors, and Lord have mercy upon us writ there, which was a sad sight to me, being the first of the kind that, to my remembrance, I ever saw. It's a well-constructed dramatic moment, and one, I would guess, that appeared after a revision, because it wonderfully and forebodingly shadows the tragedy to come. Another of these atmospheric moments of dread comes at the end of July. Quote, it was a sad noise to hear our bell to toll and ring so often today, either for deaths or burials, I think 5 or 6 times. And the next day, Pepys writes of the difficulties of, quote, the plague which grows mightily upon us, the last week being about 1,700 or 1,800 dead. In August, he notes an incident that at once distresses him, but also makes him realize how used to the horror he has become. On the night of August 15th, quote, it was dark before I could get home, and so land at churchyard stairs, where, to my great trouble, I met a dead corpse of the plague, in the narrow alley just bringing down a little pair of stairs. But I thank God I was not much disturbed at it. However, I shall beware of being late abroad again. By September, we sense the toll the pestilence has taken, and how close it has come to middle-class life. Pepys laments the deaths of his waterman Payne, a laborer he had contracted, Captain Lambert, and a man named Cuttle. Sidney Montague has fallen ill, and Mr. Lewis's other daughter, too. William Hewer and Tom Edwards have both lost their fathers. The victims here have names, they're people. They had rich thoughts and experiences themselves. Perhaps their diaries could have been written. And now they're gone. Maybe only mentioned in Pepys' lament. Dear Diary, for this episode on diaries, and especially Pepys's, I'd like to create a bit of narrative tension. You know the thing, some catharsis, purging fear and dread, and then some light, humorous moments. Then back to the tragedy. But Pepys doesn't really let me do that. Not his fault. He lived through interesting times. Because just after the plague subsided, someone decided to have the Great Fire of London in 1666. The problem started in Pudding Lane near the city centre, in a bakery owned by Thomas Farriner, probably an improperly dampened oven. The conflagration spread rapidly through the densely packed city, aided by relentless winds. After 4 days, 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, the Royal Exchange, Guildhall, and St. Paul's Cathedral were destroyed. Some 80,000 people were left homeless. Charles II was instrumental in the firefighting efforts and in organizing relief, as well as getting Sir Christopher Wren, perhaps the greatest architect of the age, to plan the reconstruction. Pepys' entry for the day the fire started, September 2nd, 1666, feels rather blasé. Quote, "Some of our maids sitting up late last night to get things ready against our feast today, Jane called us up about 3 in the morning to tell us of a great fire they saw in the city. So I rose and slipped on my nightgown and went to her window and thought it to be on the backside of Mark Lane at the farthest. But being unused to such fires as followed, I thought it far off enough, and so went again to bed and to sleep." But of course, as time goes on, the extent of the threat becomes clearer. By later in the morning, reports of up to 300 houses gutted in Pudding Lane, Fish Street, and St. Magnus Church. People begin to panic, choosing flight rather than fight the fire. Quote, "Everybody endeavoring to remove their goods and flinging into the river or bringing them into lighters that lay off. Or people staying in their houses as long as till the very fire touched them, and then running into boats or clambering from one pair of stairs by the waterside to another. And among other things, the poor pigeons, I perceive, were loath to leave their houses, but hovered about the windows and balconies till they were, some of them, burned their wings and fell down." Wait, here's a little amuse-bouche to cleanse the palate. Pepys and his friend Sir William Penn, his son would later found Pennsylvania, they decide to bury their valuables to spare them the fire. Among other things, which are not specified, are, quote, "our wine and my Parmesan cheese." Ha! I reckon Parm was rather costly and exotic at the time for it to merit mention here. Now, while Pepys is saving his dinner, our old friend John Evelyn is recording the events in his own diary. Quote, "2nd September 1666, this fatal night about 10 began a deplorable fire near Fish Street in London." Very stoic, that. He holds public prayers in his home, then takes a coach to Southwark, where the sight of the devastation moves him. Quote, "The conflagration was so universal, and the people so astonished, that from the beginning, I know not by what desponding or fate, they hardly stirred to quench it, so as there was nothing heard or seen but crying out and lamentation, and running about like distracted creatures, without at all attempting to save even their goods, such a strange consternation there was upon them." Evelyn details many of the strategies for halting the fire's progress, tearing down buildings, blowing up houses. He compares the London that, quote, "was, but is no more," to the biblical city of Sodom, though it seems only in the scale of its destruction, not to any retribution for immorality. At the end of his September 4th entry, there's an ambivalent little coda. Quote, "In this calamitous condition I returned with a sad heart to my house, blessing and adoring the distinguishing mercy of God to me and mine, who in the midst of all this ruin was like Lot in my little Zoar, safe and sound. So the Sodom allusion is reinforced in the allusion to Lot, and while the sentiment expressed here, thank God my family is all right, it's perfectly understandable, but there's also a slight sense of, better them than us. I don't mean to smear John Evelyn. He's clearly overwhelmed with grief and compassion. But it's so human to search for solace that might dilute the absolute purity of that compassion, and to praise God for sparing you when He didn't seem to see fit to spare others. But that's what's great about these diaries. We get to see the whole person. I mean, yes, it's a mediated access, language choices, revisions, editing decisions, but it's as inside one's head as we can reasonably get. To go back to Samuel Pepys, we may not always like what we find in there. For instance, in addition to its passages on the coronation, the plague, and the Great Fire, his diary is distinguished for its rather frank discussion of his extracurricular sex life. It's quite probable that not all of his sexual exploits were entirely consensual. Maybe the most famous affair he had was with one Deborah Willett. Pepys was in his mid-30s, well established in the Navy office. Deborah, just 17 when she entered the Pepys household as a companion to his wife, Elizabeth, whom he had married when she was 14, 8 years his junior. In one memorable diary entry from October 1668, he admits, candidly, awkwardly, even guiltily, to embracing Deborah in his study and being caught in the act by his wife. Quote, "Coming up suddenly, did find me embracing the girl con my hand sub sucotes, and indeed I was with my main in her cunny. I was at a wonderful loss upon it, and the girl also." It's a scene that's both comic and deeply uncomfortable. Elizabeth bursts in, Pepys stammers, Deborah flees, and everything unravels. When Pepys writes about it afterward, he's ashamed, sort of. He vows to stop seeing Deborah, sort of. He prays for strength and then falls back into temptation again. It's messy, raw, and very human. Poor Deborah was eventually dismissed, but Pepys couldn't quite let go. He continued to pursue her, even arranging secret meetings afterward. Historians often debate just how consensual this relationship was, given the power dynamic, the age gap, and the era. What we're left with is an uncomfortable yet revealing glimpse into private life in Restoration England, a time when public morals and private behavior were often worlds apart. And Pepys, with his compulsive honesty, leaves it all on the page. Well, diary, I think those are the major things I'd like to talk about in this episode. Am I missing anything? Very probably. Yeah, I didn't mention at all Pepys's encounter with Margaret Cavendish. She wrote the Blazing World, remember? Or that quite interesting story about the frantic man who was paid 40 shillings to have sheep's blood transfused into his body to see if it would calm his nerves. Or all about all the plays he went to see. He didn't care for Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. But I think this episode is already going to be quite long, and I don't really want to infringe on my listeners' valuable time. And I'd still have to remind them to post a 5-star review if they'd be so kind. Repost episodes on their social media feeds. That's a good idea, actually. That would help build an audience. And as always, there's the delicate matter of putting my hand out for a bit of cash to keep the show going. And of course, I have to thank them very kindly for their support. Well, diary, I think I'll sign off for now.